In the 1960s, families gathered around the television to laugh together. Back then, comedy brought joy without judgment, and entertainment existed for one purpose: pure laughter. Sitcoms from this era didn't just make people smile, they created shared moments across the country, the kind everyone still remembers decades later. But here's the twist. Those same shows, the ones that defined an entire generation, would never survive if they premiered today. These are the sitcoms America once loved, and why they could never happen again. Bewitched starred Elizabeth Montgomery as Samantha, a witch married to mortal advertising executive Darren Stevens. The central conflict was simple. Samantha possessed incredible magical powers, but Darren wanted her to live as an ordinary housewife without using magic. For 8 seasons, America watched Samantha struggle between her supernatural abilities and her husband's demands for normalcy. She could solve any problem with a twitch of her nose, but Darren insisted she handle situations the mortal way to fit into suburban society. Episodes typically featured some domestic crisis, bills to pay, dinner parties to host, or problems with neighbors. Samantha would promise to handle things without magic, then secretly cast spells when mortal solutions proved inadequate. When Darren discovered her magical intervention, they would argue, but ultimately reconcile through mutual understanding. The humor came from watching an incredibly powerful being voluntarily limit herself for love. Samantha could reshape reality, but she chose suburban contentment over cosmic dominance. Her magic often backfired in amusing ways, creating bigger problems that required more elaborate spells to fix. The show presented this dynamic as loving compromise, where both partners made sacrifices for their marriage to work. Samantha respected her husband's wishes while occasionally bending the rules when absolutely necessary. Today, this premise would be seen as a woman suppressing her talents to satisfy an insecure husband. Modern viewers would interpret Samantha's willingness to hide her abilities as psychological abuse disguised as romantic comedy. The entire concept of a supremely powerful woman diminishing herself for male approval would be considered fundamentally toxic to contemporary values about gender equality and female empowerment. Network executives would never greenlight a show where the female lead consistently minimizes her extraordinary capabilities to keep her ordinary husband comfortable. I Dream of Jeannie featured astronaut Tony Nelson, who discovered a beautiful genie in a bottle on a deserted beach. Jeannie became devoted to her rescuer, calling him Master and using her unlimited magical powers to serve his every need. The show's opening credits showed Jeannie literally bowing before Tony while addressing him as her master. For 5 seasons, this all-powerful being chose to spend her immortal existence catering to one ordinary man's problems and whims. Barbara Eden's Jeannie was charming, beautiful, and possessed abilities that made her essentially omnipotent. She could travel through time, alter reality, and grant any wish imaginable. Yet she focused entirely on cooking Tony's meals, cleaning his apartment, and solving his romantic difficulties. The comedy came from Jeannie's magical solutions creating unintended complications. Her attempts to help often backfired spectacularly, forcing Tony to explain away impossible situations to his commanding officers and neighbors. Episodes featured Jeannie using cosmic powers for mundane domestic tasks. She would magically prepare elaborate dinners, redecorate Tony's apartment, or eliminate threats to his career advancement. Her magic was essentially a supernatural housekeeping service. The show presented female devotion as romantic fantasy. Jeannie's willingness to serve Tony completely was portrayed as the ultimate expression of love and loyalty between them. Modern audiences would see this as glorified slavery disguised as romance. Having a woman literally call a man master while serving his every need would trigger immediate outrage about oppressive gender roles and female subjugation. The visual elements alone would cause massive controversy. Jeannie's revealing costume and submissive posturing would be condemned as objectification designed for male fantasy rather than empowering female representation. Today's television would never feature a female character whose entire existence revolves around serving male needs. Such content would be universally condemned as harmful to social progress. Hogan's Heroes was set in Stalag 13, a Nazi prisoner of war camp during World War II. The show followed Allied prisoners running elaborate schemes under the noses of bumbling German guards, turning history's deadliest conflict into light-hearted comedy. Colonel Hogan led fellow prisoners in operations that made their captors look like harmless buffoons. Episodes featured tunnels, radio equipment, and sabotage missions that somehow remained invisible to camp authorities. Bob Crane's Hogan was charming and resourceful, outsmarting Colonel Klink and Sergeant Schultz in increasingly ridiculous plots. The prisoners lived comfortably with access to fine food, wine, and female companionship while supposedly being held in a secure military prison. The show's humor relied on audiences finding Nazi incompetence amusing rather than terrifying. German officers were presented as bumbling bureaucrats more concerned with personal advancement than running effective prison camps. For 6 seasons, families gathered to watch comedy set in the heart of Nazi Germany. Children laughed at Sergeant Schultz's catchphrase, "I see nothing," while parents enjoyed clever schemes that made Allied prisoners look heroic. The show created sympathetic German characters who seemed more interested in avoiding trouble than supporting Hitler's regime. Colonel Klink was portrayed as a vain fool, desperate for promotion, while Schultz appeared to deliberately ignore prisoner activities. Modern audiences would be horrified by comedy set in Nazi concentration camps. Any attempt to make light of locations where millions of innocent people suffered torture and death would be considered fundamentally inappropriate. Holocaust survivors and their families would demand immediate removal of content that trivialized locations associated with systematic genocide. The contrast between comedic portrayals and documented historical reality would be considered deeply offensive. Today's television executives would never consider producing comedy content set in concentration camps or prisoner of war facilities. The entire concept would be universally rejected as inappropriate for entertainment. The Beverly Hillbillies followed the Clampett family after they discovered oil on their Ozark property and moved to Beverly Hills with newfound wealth. The show's humor came from contrasting mountain culture with sophisticated California lifestyle. Jed Clampett, Granny, Ellie Mae, and Jethro provided 9 seasons of comedy based on their confusion about elevators, swimming pools, telephones, and urban social customs. Episodes featured the family's attempts to understand city life while maintaining their mountain traditions. The show presented rural Americans as lovably ignorant folks who couldn't grasp basic concepts despite having unlimited money to purchase education and refinement. Their continued attachment to mountain customs was treated as amusing evidence of backwardness. Granny's folk medicine was ridiculed as primitive superstition. Jethro's lack of formal education provided constant comedy material. Ellie Mae's love of animals was portrayed as inability to understand sophisticated social relationships. The humor relied on audiences feeling superior to people from different cultural backgrounds. City viewers could laugh at mountain customs while feeling sophisticated about their own urban knowledge. Episodes often featured the Clampetts misunderstanding modern technology in ways that confirmed stereotypes about rural intellectual limitations. Their wealth couldn't overcome their essential hillbilly nature. The show's enduring popularity demonstrated widespread acceptance of class-based humor that mocked working-class rural culture. Audiences enjoyed watching wealthy hillbillies fail to achieve true sophistication. Modern social justice advocates would condemn the Beverly Hillbillies for cruel stereotyping of working-class Americans. The show would be seen as reinforcing harmful assumptions about people from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. Contemporary critics would argue that such programming contributed to urban contempt for rural communities and justified policies that ignored rural poverty and limited educational opportunities. Today's television would never produce content that consistently portrayed rural Americans as inherently less intelligent than urban residents. Such programming would be considered harmful to national unity. Green Acres featured New York lawyer Oliver Wendell Douglas, who moved his reluctant wife Lisa to a rundown farm in Hooterville. The comedy came from Oliver's attempts to apply city logic to country problems while dealing with eccentric locals. Eddie Albert's Oliver was an educated professional who believed modern techniques could improve traditional farming methods. Eva Gabor's Lisa was a glamorous socialite, completely unprepared for rural domestic responsibilities. Episodes featured Oliver's mounting frustration with local customs that defied logical explanation. The townspeople of Hooterville operated according to their own peculiar rules that made perfect sense to them, but drove Oliver to distraction. The show portrayed rural Americans as charmingly simple people whose resistance to progress was inherently amusing to sophisticated viewers. Local characters seemed content with inefficient traditional methods. Lisa's character provided additional comedy through her complete inability to perform basic household tasks. Her cooking disasters and housekeeping failures were treated as evidence of feminine incompetence rather than lack of training. The humor relied on audiences sharing Oliver's frustration with country customs and appreciating his superior urban knowledge. Viewers could feel intellectually superior while watching educated city folk struggle with backward rural culture. Local characters like Mr. Haney and Ebb were presented as lovable idiots whose limited intelligence was their defining characteristic. Their inability to understand Oliver's reasonable suggestions confirmed stereotypes about rural intellectual limitations. Modern audiences would find Green Acres problematic for its portrayal of rural Americans as less capable than their urban counterparts. The show would be criticized for reinforcing urban bias and condescension. Contemporary rural advocacy groups would object to programming that consistently portrayed country people as intellectually inferior and resistant to beneficial change for no rational reason. Today's television would avoid content that portrayed rural Americans as inherently less intelligent than urban residents, recognizing such representations as harmful to social cohesion. Amos and Andy began as a radio show featuring white performers playing black characters for white audiences. The television version used black actors, but maintained storylines created by white writers who relied on racial stereotypes. The show centered around characters whose behavior reinforced negative assumptions about African American intelligence, work ethic, and social competence. Episodes featured schemes that portrayed black characters as lazy, dishonest, or incompetent. Characters spoke in exaggerated dialects that bore little resemblance to actual African American speech, but matched white assumptions about black vernacular. Their goals and aspirations were presented as inherently limited. The humor relied on audiences finding black characters' failures amusing rather than tragic. Their struggles with employment, relationships, and social advancement were treated as comedy material. Even during its original broadcast period, civil rights organizations recognized Amos and Andy as harmful to racial progress. The NAACP successfully campaigned to remove the show from television. The show's characters embodied every negative stereotype that justified discrimination against African Americans. Their portrayal suggested that black social problems resulted from character flaws rather than institutional racism. Episodes consistently showed black characters failing to achieve success through their own incompetence. This reinforced white beliefs that racial inequality was natural rather than artificially maintained. Modern civil rights organizations would demand immediate removal of any platform hosting such content. The show would be universally recognized as propaganda designed to reinforce racial prejudice. Today's television executives would never consider producing content that relied on racial stereotypes, recognizing such material as fundamentally harmful to racial progress. Gilligan's Island followed 7 castaways stranded on a tropical island after their tour boat was shipwrecked. The comedy came from their repeated failed attempts to escape, usually because Gilligan's bumbling would sabotage rescue opportunities. The show featured the professor creating sophisticated devices from coconuts and bamboo, while Gilligan consistently ruined their chances of returning to civilization through increasingly absurd mishaps. Mary Ann and Ginger represented two types of female appeal: wholesome girl next door versus glamorous movie star. Both characters existed primarily to provide romantic interest and domestic support rather than contributing survival skills. Episodes occasionally featured native islanders portrayed through crude stereotypes that presented indigenous people as primitive, superstitious, and threatening to civilized castaways. The show's gender dynamics confined women to traditional roles, despite the survival situation that should have prioritized practical skills over physical attractiveness. Mary Ann cooked and cleaned, while Ginger provided glamorous entertainment. The castaways' treatment of their island environment reflected assumptions that natural resources existed solely for their convenience, rather than as part of complex ecosystems requiring respect. Modern environmental activists would criticize the characters' treatment of their island home as materials to exploit rather than a living system to preserve. Contemporary feminists would condemn the show's reduction of female characters to romantic objects and domestic servants rather than capable individuals who could contribute equally to group survival. Indigenous rights advocates would object to the portrayal of native islanders as primitive obstacles to civilized progress rather than sophisticated people with complex cultures. Today's television would never produce content that consistently portrayed women as primarily decorative or indigenous people as threatening primitives. These shows disappeared because entertainment became political rather than innocent. The 1960s created comedy that brought families together through shared laughter and common cultural experiences. Today, those same programs would be destroyed by audiences who find offense more satisfying than joy. The sitcoms of the 1960s were genuinely funny, and every single one would be cancelled today. Anyway, that's it for the video, folks. Bye.